So my name is Amy Strauss, and I'm a graduate student at UMass. I'm going to be emceeing the panel tonight. So I'll be asking questions to our featured scientists, and we'll break for audience questions at 3 points throughout the panel tonight. So please hold your questions until we do that break, but know that we'll have 3 opportunities to do that throughout. So you can hold your questions for that. Without further ado, let me introduce our scientists. So as a graduate student, it's really fun to study with the amazing science community here in Amherst, and so I'm really excited to hear from them, and I'll let you know who we have here today. So Dr. Patty Brennan is a visiting lecturer of biological sciences at Mount Holyoke College. Jeff Bettner is the lab manager for the Elkington Lab at UMass Amherst Department of Environmental Conservation. And Dr. Allison Roy is the assistant unit leader of fisheries with the Massachusetts Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit and research assistant professor in UMass Amherst Department of Environmental Conservation. So let's welcome our scientists. And to start, so we're good, no mics. To start, I'm just going to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about the research area, what work you do broadly. So, Patty, you can start.
So, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and that means that I am interested in studying how evolution has impacted organisms, and in particular, I'm interested in looking at vertebrates and vertebrate reproduction. So I essentially try to understand how is it that animals come together to make babies, and very specifically, actually, how they come together to have sex.
Thank you. Jeff.
I'm Jeff Bettner, and I've been working in Dr. Elkington's lab for 31 years now, so I've done a little bit of everything, but it's I guess they'd call me a wildlife biologist. I kind of consider myself, I'll do anything outdoors biological for money, so they sometimes call me a biostitute. That's probably the best way to put it. But I just enjoy pretty much being outside and being able to jump in at whatever thing. My main focus is generally on parasites, so I work on parasites mostly of butterflies and moths, so that when a new insect comes into the country, we try and figure out ways to eradicate it or at least suppress the numbers and keep the numbers down. So.
Great. And I'm an aquatic ecologist. Ecologists study relationships between animals and their environment, and the environments I love to work in are freshwater environments, so streams and lakes mostly. I tend to study impacts of humans and human disturbances in the landscape on lakes and streams. And then more recently, I've started to get into looking at responses to management. So how can we manage our environment such that we have fewer impacts on these aquatic systems?
Cool, thanks. So you all work on really interesting and different topics, and I want to hear a little bit about how you got into these fields and into biology in general. So can you tell us what initially sparked your interest in science, or how you realized you wanted to pursue science as a career? And I'll start with Allison.
Great. Well, so I come from a family of a lot of engineers, and I knew I didn't want to be like everybody else. So what can I do with math and science? So science was interesting. I guess earliest influential was going to environmental camp in junior high and just really being excited about everything outdoors, much like them. Everything outdoors is fun. Didn't realize exactly what I could do as a scientist and explored a lot of things in college, but during undergrad was really when my advisors and mentors then sent me in the direction of streams. I explored marine environments. I think, sometimes when we like water and we like to be outside, we're told we need to be a marine biologist, and there are actually aquatic biologists that aren't marine biologists. but back early on, how many of us know that? Like, there are other kinds of biology. And then specifically ecology, you know, it just was one of those things that formed throughout my undergrad career with really awesome professors and great opportunities to interact. I was interacting with high school students and middle school students and upper elementary students, having them sample in streams, and it was really fun, and it was a great environment that we could get our hands wet and work in those systems. And I always wanted to work with things that I could see, so working with fish and bugs were at least big enough that got me excited about the field that I work in.
Cool. Pat?
Well, so I grew up in Bogota, which is a city, you know, the capital of Colombia, and it's an ugly city, you know. It's just, you just have like stray dogs and pigeons, and that's all the nature you're gonna get. And when I was 13 years old, actually, my dad took us in our first vacation to the coast, and I actually went scuba diving. Not scuba diving really, but snorkeling. And I completely fell in love with this experience of this beauty, which was completely overwhelming to me. And I said, what do I have to do to actually see this kind of stuff all the time? And that was marine biology, so I became a marine biologist. And it was great, it was beautiful and amazing, and then I ended up deciding to become a real scientist when I had the opportunity to work on a boat where we were following whales around the Galapagos Islands. And I was supposed to be the marine biologist on the boat who knew all these different species of whales, except that we had a sighting one time of these big whales where, you know, we saw them for a long time because there was a baby, and the baby couldn't dive so deeply, so the baby was at the surface, and we took great pictures, and I had all my books out, and we're looking at all the guides of marine mammals, and this whale was nowhere in these guides, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, this whale is not here, I'm supposed to know what the whales are. And the whale wasn't there, and it turns out actually that the whale was the first live sighting of a whale that had previously only been identified by its skull. And my mind just exploded because I was like, this is a whale. Are there like whales out there that we don't know? And so I just, you know, the excitement of discovering something like that was too much not to pursue forever.
Thanks. Allison, can you describe what steps you took between becoming interested in science? I guess you kind of touched on this, but becoming interested in science and the very long title that you have today. How did you get from A to B?
Yeah, and it wasn't a whole lot of straight steps, but I did actually so I went to an undergraduate institution, a small liberal arts college, Allegheny College, and was very inspired to be a professor at that point with wonderful, wonderful professors that were just, you know, really got me excited about doing that. And so I went straight to graduate school and had so much fun there. I went to the University of Georgia, loved it there, couldn't get enough of it, and just kept on for my PhD. And so here I'm, goodness, what was I, like 27 or something, graduating from grad school and not having a whole lot of life experiences. But what I did know, all I knew was academia. I knew college. And all I wanted to do was teach. Unfortunately, I didn't have all the experiences I needed to teach, and I was also kind of tired of academia a little bit. So, and I wanted to do science that would affect policies and management, how we do things. And so I had an opportunity to go work for the Environmental Protection Agency for my postdoc, and I spent 5 years there. And it was really eye-opening in the one, I was in the part of the EPA that just does research, and the research that we did was just like any researcher anywhere else in terms of how it got funneled into policy. So really, I learned that I didn't need to be in the EPA to do research that influenced policy. So that was pretty important and eye-opening. And I also realized that I missed that connection to academia. So I landed a position in a teaching institution, very much like I always thought I wanted to be in, at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, and had a wonderful experience there. Yet I think that was the first time in my life I realized that I liked the research side too. So, you know, you get so focused on what you want to do in life, and you want to teach, and I was missing out on research because at an institution like that, you teach your day-to-day life for 8 months of the year is just teaching. And I had somebody in Massachusetts who had been trying to get me to come to Massachusetts to study things in Massachusetts, who had said, hey, there's this position opening. And so I kind of did it behind the scenes. I didn't tell my chair, I didn't tell anybody, took a couple days off and came up here to interview. And I left and said, wow, if they offer me the job, I'm gonna have a hard time turning it down because it seems awesome here. And so the job that I do right now is heavily research, a little bit of teaching, but the research as part of, so I'm part of the federal government, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. We work with the state agencies directly to deal with important management issues that they have. So there's a lot of working directly with agencies, and they are actually implementing some of the management based on what we're finding out, which is a really exciting place for me to be doing science that is extremely applied and influencing management and environment. So I've been here for 5 years.
Thanks. Let's see. Jeff, scientists often have to focus on a very narrow subject area in order to make discoveries. So how did you land on your specific, I know you said that you kind of study everything or like everything, but when you're actually doing a study, how did you land on a specific subject area of choice?
It found me more than anything. My father was a really good naturalist, so I grew up in the outdoors a lot. My mom did not like natural history, so for me it was, my dad would pack me a lunch in the morning. He was a Boy Scout director, and we had like 1,300 acres to round through. And he would pack me a lunch in the morning and say, I'll meet you at 5 o'clock, and give me a rough idea of where you're going to be, and I would be off. And I don't think my mom had any clue that my dad was not watching over me all day. But I would go dig fossils, I would go catch bugs, I would go catch whatever. And so it kind of grew a lot. I grew up in Detroit, so that was just a really amazing thing to get every summer to just go out and just play all summer and do whatever. And so I kind of had a little bit of everything, and I was really into botany. My bedroom when I was a kid was so many plants that I had to actually run a garden hose from the basement all the way up to my bedroom to water it. Drove my mom crazy, but otherwise I was going up and down the stairs so many times with water jug. And then, so I really thought I was going to be a botanist. I went to college, and the first semester I took a botany course, and I absolutely hated it. And it was all cellular stuff. It wasn't the plants that I was so used to seeing, and I just couldn't get into it. And I almost dropped out of school altogether. And then a professor from University of Michigan came and taught one of our classes, and I got so excited by what he was teaching that I actually just changed everything. And I went to University of Michigan for environmental studies, and it was more field biology based, so I could actually be in the outdoors, learn more of the outdoor things. From there, I did a lot of bird banding, and so I kind of gave up the plant world and thought, oh, birds is it. I'm going to study birds. And I worked on like 120 different species of birds. I tagged about 8 species of owls up at Whitefish Point in northern Michigan, which is like the world's largest owl migration point. I was tagging a lot of passerine birds, small birds in Detroit area. And then I came out here and did an internship in Manomet Bird Observatory and worked there for a while. While I was at Manomet, I actually met up with Dr. Joe Elkington, who I'm working with now, actually hired us to do some bird survey work. And then the next spring, he was looking for somebody to just fill in for 2 weeks. And so I came to work for Joe for 2 weeks, and that was 31 years ago. And Joe is just into so many different things that it's just a great place for me because I like doing parasite work, and there was a lot of parasite type work there. So we look at a lot of different butterflies and how they, butterflies and moths, so I'm doing both insect conservation and insect control. And I don't know, it just kind of worked its way that way for me.
Thanks. And Allison, can you tell us so you study aquatic ecosystems, but how do you get down focused enough to like decide what data you're going to go out and collect? Like how do you get from big picture to narrow picture?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that, it kind of goes to what I was talking about before about integrating a lot with the state management agencies. So a lot of the questions are driven by them and what they find is important. So for one example, when I first started here, the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, they've been getting a lot of questions about what the effects of wintertime lake drawdowns are on lake fish. And so in a lot of lakes around here, we draw down the water in the wintertime and then refill them in the springtime. A lot of it is done for trying to remove weeds from the lakes, maybe to protect people's docks. But here Fish and Wildlife is trying to figure out if this is an activity that is harmful to fishes, then maybe we need to have more guidance toward conservation commissions and lake associations that govern these drawdowns. And so that was a problem. Never considered it before in my life. I actually hadn't worked on lakes a whole lot before that point, but hey, I know how to study aquatic systems. I know how to study fish. Let's put our minds together and figure out how to design a study to answer a real management problem. And frankly, most of my questions come that way. The most recent is working on mussels. So I've never worked on freshwater mussels before, and now I have a really big freshwater mussel research program starting on listed endangered and threatened mussels because of interests of cooperators.
Cool. All right. Patty, can you tell us in your words what makes a good scientist?
What makes a good scientist? Well, I think really good observational skills are key. And so the ability to notice things that are just a little different, right? So we walk around. Once you have a scientific mind, you learn to walk around and always ask questions about everything you see. And so that means you have to be able to really watch the world around you carefully. And then that will extend to things that you read and you learn, right? And so it's that ability to, read something that might hold some small clue about one big unknown that you can jump into as a scientist. So being a good observer for sure, but then also I think being stubborn is very helpful. And so when you're a scientist, we have this idea that there's like this linear process, and that we ask a question, and then it's like you ask the question, your hypotheses, and then you test it, and you try to get the data, and then you get the data, and then you have your conclusion, and you're done. And in reality, it never really works like that, never ever. So you have a question, and then you try to test it, and then it fails, and then you have to go back and re-ask your question, and there's a lot of iterations, and so you can't give up. You have to be able to follow through, and then be willing to fail multiple times, and then just keep at it until you get what you really need. And then that will translate into a good scientist. A really good scientist then has to be able to share those results with others, and those others being other scientists or the public, and so being able to communicate those in writing typically, which is what we do, which is write lots of papers. Then that would be my third criteria.
Thanks. And the last question in this section, and then we'll break to hear from you guys, is what advice do you have for people considering a career in science? Maybe there's some people out there considering a career in science, but what advice maybe do you wish you had received earlier in your career? And Jeff, I'll have you.
I would start with, hopefully you read a lot because that's really where a lot of it starts, and reading old things, new things on whatever subject you are. Read outside your field, so try and grasp as much as you can. And the other really important one is try and go to meetings of whatever the field is that you're in. For me, it's really a struggle because I like so many different things. So I found like the conservation biology department, the Society for Conservation Biology is just like a really fantastic place to go, because those meetings have a little bit of birds, a little bit of mammals, a little bit of herps, and it crosses disciplines. And I think that's really important, because a lot of times the people who are just focused on mammals or birds or whatever don't realize that there's other new ideas coming up through the other fields, and if you don't go to each other's meetings, you really don't see some of these new ideas that are coming out. And so I think it opens your mind a lot to just try and get to as many different meetings, partly because if you're starting out, one of the things you want to do is find who is it that I want to mentor with, who do I want to work under, and for me, the really ironic thing is I had actually told my advisor at University of Michigan that what I really wanted to do was population dynamics, and he said, well, you don't really have enough math to really get into the deep population dynamics. Well, then I met Joe, and it was like, that's what he does for a living, and it was like, it was just a natural fit. I get to do the outside stuff. Joe's got the math skills. We can combine that. You don't necessarily have to have the skills for everything in that particular field, and I think that's sometimes a mistake to have people so pigeonholed on a certain subject. So I would say broaden your mind that way is really important to me.
Yeah, that's great. And Allison, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I had 3 ideas, and 2 of them were already almost covered already. So I absolutely agree. A lot of the really interesting scientific discoveries happening right now are coming about by integrating across disciplines. And so that really is the ticket to novel work right now. So I think that's really important. I'm also going to take what Patty said in a different context. The last thing she talked about was writing up your results at the end. You know, we can't do science. Scientists who just do science and don't share it, it's not doing any good to anybody. We're not learning from it. So we have to be communicating. And the common avenue that we communicate to other scientists is in conferences and through scientific publications. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't read those things. It's just lost it. You know, so we need to be great communicators everywhere. So we need to be communicating to the public, communicating to people who can change what they're doing, management. We need to be working directly with them. And the more, we don't get trained so much as scientists to be good communicators. That's all in the humanities side of things. But honestly, the best scientists are those who can communicate really, really well about their topics. So I think that's important. And then lastgoing so I work for the federal government, and I'm kind of anticipating a question of, like, you know, how are you going to do science now with this current climate? And actually a postdoc in my lab asked that question of the director of the co-op unit system, the person who directs all of the co-op units nationwide, who was here last week. And he said, you know, the best thing that you can do is have integrity. You know, don't cut corners, be honest with everything that you are doing. So for aspiring scientists, I mean, really that is the best lesson that we can have, is just do science with integrity, and then everything that comes out of that is totally defensible. And I think as long as we keep that in mind, we're probably in good shape.
Great, thank you. So we can now take some audience questions.
So I'm going to ask that question in regard. The world is changing, specifically in terms of public perception of science and funding of science. So my question is about your hopes and fears about the practice of your science in the coming, say, decade.
Well, my fear is I'm not going to get any money. I'm not going to get any grants from the government, because what I do is basic research. It doesn't solve any problems. It's not going to, you know, cure cancer or anything like that. And so I would anticipate that kind of science is the easiest one to cut, and so that I probably wouldn't get grants to continue to do what I do.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, since I do a lot of very applied stuff, I actually don't have that fear at all. I can see a lot of funding from non-federal sources coming out, and certainly there's a lot more, you know, with this climate, there's a lot more energy, grassroots energy to do the work that we're doing. And I have a lot of faith in the public and in us as a community to get stuff done that we want to get done, to find out answers to important questions that we have. And I think there are avenues, and we'll just get creative about what those avenues are. So I try not to be discouraged about those things.
Good, anytime.
Any other questions? Or
No, yeah, that's good.
So a lot of these fields, these sort of ecology and biology fields are, I think a lot of people think of them as very sort of traditional, with naturalists of old sketching and, you know, you carrying in that tradition. Are there things in your field that are so new that you didn't even imagine that they would exist 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Sure.
question?
Yeah, changing all the time. Like, it's hard to keep up with the state of things, and that's actually especially where I mean, it's a really exciting time for students because a lot of the things that are happening now, I'm almost 60 years old. I turned 60 in a couple months, so I've seen a lot come and go, but it's really neat to see, like our lab took on building a molecular lab as a part of our, it was never a part of our goal in any of us, but now we have an ability to see how to tell one critter from another critter that we never could see before, you know, and so it's really opened up. I mean, for me I do a lot of fly taxonomy, and so it's trying to figure out what species I have to work with, and there's a great paper that just came out a few years ago where they took 13 species of generalist flies that attack different butterflies, and they DNA sequenced them, and it actually turned out there were 72 species hidden in those 13 species of flies. That shows how little we can see from just the outside world, and so we need these molecular tools. So molecular is just blown away. I mean, for entomologists, it's the thing it's gonna just, I mean, it's hard to even before DNA, people were saying there might be 30 million species on the planet, you know, for just insects alone. I mean, that's compared to like 10,000 species for birds. And I've seen recent things, there was a paper that came out last year for mammals where there's about 4,000 species of mammals on Earth, and there's now a guy who's saying that's probably underestimated by half. And so there's probably actually about 8,000 species of mammals. And this is taking things like, you know, they just split the giraffes into 4 species. The killer whales split into 4 species. And it's like, these are big things. Wait till we get to the little mice. So yeah, so that I think is where a lot is happening. So you still need the old time naturalists to really sort it out. Like you still want to be able to tell these things apart by looking at them in the end. So that takes a lot of morphological things and features and going into all of that. So.
Just following that, is this molecular information giving us more clarity on what a species is?
Or less? Yeah, what is a species? I mean, we could talk all night on what is a species. I mean, it's really, really confusing because things are blending a lot more than we ever imagined. And, you know, so it's difficult.
So the answer is no.
Yeah,
More information, right now more information but less clarity?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate thing. But I mean, that's also going to take a big leap to figure that out. And that, I mean, once we have that information, then we'll maybe be able to sort it out better. But yeah, no, it's a mess.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. So this event tonight is called A Day in the Life, right? So let's zoom in a little bit and talk about what happens on a day in your life. So what does a typical day look like for you? If you can describe like an actual concrete activity that you might do on a given day, I think that's helpful for thinking about what scientists do. So Patty, you can start off there.
Well, so I am in a teaching institution right now, and so a lot of what I do is teaching related, and so I have a lot of undergraduate students working in my lab. So on the days when I'm not teaching heavily, I will have students in the lab doing research with me, and so we'll typically begin by thawing a bunch of dead animals that are sitting in the freezer downstairs. And then we'll collect data, all sorts of morphological data about their size and their sex and their reproductive status and you know, the species that they are. And then we'll essentially start collecting their reproductive organs. And we collect different organs for different projects, and so we'll get really messy and end up collecting things that end up either in some preservative for histology, and histology is essentially when you look at the architecture of the tissues, like what cells are actually in the tissues, or you collect specimens for part of what we do, which is 3D modeling of the actual structures in their functional state. And so we get to play with crazy equipment that we put together, and sometimes it kind of explodes and sometimes it doesn't. And it's all very exciting, and you know, if I'm really having, if the day is going really well, then I'll have an opportunity to look at a bunch of different things with my students and help them to start learning to see those differences as well. And then there's really no day anymore that doesn't end with some form of going back to the teaching part, either grading papers or writing tests for the following week or preparing lectures or something like that. And so that would be a typical day.
Allison.
Well, I think you'll probably discover that there is no typical day. And I'd love to say that my typical day is where I started, like, go out in the stream and take an electrofisher out and, sample all the fish. But honestly, as somebody who manages a big lab right now, my graduate students and undergraduate students get to do all of that fun stuff out in the field. I'll come and get them started, and then I'll be doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff. And that behind the scenes stuff is really boring stuff that none of you want to know about. But I mean, we have to write grants. And in order to write grants, we have to talk to people about what's going on and do reading and then, when we do get grants, which is a long process and I won't go there, like, you have to administer them. You have to buy supplies and you have to write up reports and things like that. We do a lot. I took a day off, believe it or not. I took a day off a couple weeks ago, and taking a day off, I still had 3 hours of emails to deal with in the evening because there are just that many things just constantly going on. So I'm going to, kind of skip the boring stuff, but just say that, so today I went to Boston and gave a talk to the Division of Ecological Restoration about the research that a graduate student of mine had been doing. So he and I gave a talk this morning. Yesterday I was at an all-day conference about stream temperature, and it wasn't a formal conference where everybody was talking at you. We were all sitting around the room and talking about who's collecting temperature and where and when and how can we be doing a better job of it and what sort of questions should we be asking about it. The day before that, I had a day full of meetings with graduate students and undergrads preparing for conferences, talking about projects and study designs. And now that I've been out of the office for 2 days, tomorrow it's going to be a lot of catching back up on where things are, submitting abstracts to conferences. I mean, it's just an ongoing thing, dealing with all those emails that I haven't. I have a thesis I need to review, and it's always different. And so I guess that's part of what I love about my job, is that it's always different on a day-to-day basis. But it covers so many different things. Yeah.
Thanks. And so the next one is going to be for all three of you, and it's tell us about a fun, interesting, weird, strange, bizarre experience you've had related to doing your science. And that can be something really cool that you found or discovered, or that can be some terrible hazard that you encountered in the wild. So Patty can start us off with that one.
Well, I have a scary one and a funny one. And so the scary one is that I got lost in the Amazon forest, and that was not good. And it was just because I was following a bird. It's called a tinamou, and they're very shy and skittish. And it was literally outside my window of my cabin calling to me, and I was like, "Oh, it's so close! I'm just gonna go check it out." And then I went to check it out, and I left my compass and my maps and everything back in the house because I was just gonna be a minute. Except that the minute turned into an hour, and the hour turned into 2, and I was still with the bird, and the bird was hanging out and eating, and it was great, and then the bird went away, and then I'm like, oh, where am I? And I had absolutely no idea where I was, and it was really tricky. So evidently I made it, don't worry. And then the funny one is, so I look at reproductive organs, and I look at genitalia and penises in birds, which actually they do have penises, which most people don't know. But that means that I look at bird cloacas for many, many hours. And so one time I was trying to avert the genitalia of a swan. And swans are pretty huge, and when they don't want you to open up their cloaca, they can really tighten up their muscles, and so I was like, oh, I'm gonna get you, and the swan was like, no, you're not. And then eventually he decided to poop, and the poop went all right into my face. And I just have to say, I'm glad my mouth was closed.
All right. Jeff.
That's tough to top. One of the wildest ones that sticks with me, what was your categories? I'm trying to think. Fun?
Scary or
just
funny?
Out of the...
Yeah. I think this fills all of them, but we were working out in the Quabbin and working with Joe. I did a lot of small mammal trapping, and so we tagged like 35,000 small mammals over the course of about 15-year period of time. And at one point, Joe had gotten this idea that what we needed to do was try and increase the number of acorns in a plot to see if we could boost the mouse populations in these different things, which sounded pretty good on paper when you're lugging 100 pounds of acorns out to the Prescott Peninsula on snowshoes because the roads are not plowed. It's a little bit different of a thing, but one of the things that happened was, so I went out. We made these boxes because you didn't want to just scatter acorns to the forest, or you're basically feeding the deer, the moose, the bears, the turkey, everything else. So we made these special feeding boxes, and I had to build like 100 of them to put out in the plots, and then we would fill those with acorns, and they just had a little small entrance hole to let the mice come in, so it we'd only be increasing for the mice, and it kind of excluded chipmunks. Well, put in all this stuff, came back out, and the hole was huge, and on every box, not just one or two boxes. So I said, okay, well, we'll make metal plates, put that on the boxes. But I thought, before I do that, if I've got chipmunks out there, I'm kind of curious where they're stashing them and where they're taking them. So we were working with Bill Healy at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and he said, well, what we could do is take fluorescent powder and put it in there, and then we can track the mice on a moonlit night. So it turns out that there was going to be no moon for like a few days after this. So we filled each box with different colored paints in the boxes. That are just a non-toxic paint, so it doesn't hurt the animal. They can brush it off, lick it off, doesn't really matter. And so we had a picture of fluorescent blues, fluorescent oranges, greens, all these different things in these boxes. And then we went out on a moonless night without any moon at all, and took black lights into the forest. We rigged up a whole bunch of black lights, and then we said 1, 2, 3, and we flipped on the lights, and there were fluorescent day-glow flying squirrels, like just feet from our heads. I mean, blue ones, red ones, pink ones, green ones. Each one had their own little box. It was just the most surreal thing that I've ever encountered, and I felt bad for the squirrels, but they were having a blast. They would fly through the air, land on a tree, and when they hit the tree, it just went poof. And so we actually were able to go through and actually track some of the mice and the chipmunks and things like that, and so we learned a heck of a lot in a single night. It was just a fabulous, hard to repeat kind of thing. So.
That's cool. All right. Let's see what you got.
Go on to another question.
Well, I can, for you guys, ask about hazards in the field. So that's kind of a cool, fun story. You had a hazard in there, but I know that you've encountered hazards in your time too. So Allison, why don't you tell us about some of the scary pieces?
So most of what I do is out in the landscape, and so that means you're on other people's property all the time, and of course you're always asking permission when you first go and ask permission. I actually used to argue with a postdoc in Georgia. He would put on this southern accent. He was like, I can get anybody to permission. I'm like, oh no, I'm female. I can get anybody, you know. But I did have one experience of getting bit by a dog. The owner was right there. The dog was tied up, and he watched the dog come bite me before he was going to talk to me about whether I could be on his property. So this is not appropriate. I've had students. I'd gotten permission at a site, and students called back and said, we just got shot at in the field. I mean, like, this is urban areas, and they just like decided they wanted to scare them off because they didn't want them on their property. And then one experience with me in the field, I was in the field actually doing that fun fish electroshocking stuff, and we got called out, and then the police were there, and then we're like, what are the police doing? He starts taking down all of our information. Why are you here? And like, I've been here lots of times. We have permission. We're on this horse farm. And finally, the person who called the police on us came out, and the owner who had gotten permission, I said, you know who I am. Why did you call the police? And they said, oh, well, we saw that government vehicle, and we just had 9/11, so we figured we should call the police and figure out what's going on. So it was this 9/11 excuse. So yeah, it's very bizarre what people get afraid of when you're out in the field, even if you look non-intimidating.
All right. And this again is also for all three of you. What's your favorite part of being a scientist? Allison.
I love asking questions. I love even more getting the answers to the questions and then finding 5 times more questions when you get the answer than when you started, and that's really fun. Did you say the reward? What's rewarding as a scientist?
What's your favorite part? What's rewarding? Either one. Yeah.
You know, what's really rewarding to me is working with students, and that's why I like being in the academic environment. It's really wonderful to work with graduate students who are just discovering so many new things, and they push me in a lot of different ways, which is really fun and exciting. And now that I've started to have students graduate, it's really, really rewarding when they get jobs, and then you're working with them in these other agencies. That's really fun. And I mean, Patty will talk about teaching, but teaching is also incredibly rewarding, especially when students are totally opened up to a whole nother world and come out at the end of the class and saying, you know, I worked so hard, but I learned so much. And it's like, oh, you can't beat that. So,
Cool. Go ahead.
I think for me, definitely, there's a little moment in time when you have been asking a question and you're trying to figure it out, and then you figure it out. And before you share it with anybody else, before you even start talking about it with anybody else, it's that moment that's like, you have the answer. You just know something that nobody else in the world knows. It's yours, right? You figure it out, and it's completely addictive, and it's just beautiful. I hope that some of you will have the chance to experience this many, many times over, because it's really very cool.
I'll second that too. And I mean, you think about science as being these eureka moments when you have these really great ideas, but it's a lot of it. You just gotta immerse yourself and enjoy the day-to-day things, because they're going to be tedious, they're going to be tough, but they're still fun. And especially if you work with small mammals or birds or things like that, it's just every day is a surprise. You don't know what you're going to get into, but I can say we've had a few eureka moments in our lab, and the most fun one that I'll treasure till I die is with Joe. We were all reading the same paper on brown-tail moth, and brown-tail moth is this really nasty moth that actually killed 3 entomologists working on it, because it's got these really nasty hairs that insert histamines into your system, and so your body just goes into basically shock, and you break out in a really severe rash. And we're sitting at the table reading these old papers, and one of them was on brown-tail moth, and it was a 1928 paper, and people have been reading it for 75 years, and basically its conclusion was that parasites play no role in brown-tail moth. And Joe just looked at us, and I just saw him light up, and it was like at that exact moment I could see it. And I know Joe probably remembers it too, but we're all sitting at the table, we've all read the exact same paper, and Joe gets it. and he says, I know why brown-tail moth disappeared. And it's like, take this table that's in the thing, rearrange it by the distance from the ocean, and we did that, like, literally right then and there. We rearranged the table, and it turned out, like, what they were saying was that they had this table that was just all these different cities and the amount of parasitism, and it was like 10% parasitism, 80% parasitism, 10%, 12, whatever. But when you arranged it from the ocean out, you could see there was no parasitism near the ocean and tons of parasitism in for this insect. And it was just like a light bulb went off. And so it led to Joe's like, we have to study brown-tail moth. And I'm just thinking, oh man, why does it have to be brown-tail moth that he gets the excitement on? But we ended up going on working on it for 4 years, and Joe was really pretty much dead on that insight. And so it's just really fun to see someone get it. Almost as much fun as doing it yourself.
And then on the flip side, what's the biggest challenge of being a scientist? And that's for Patty.
Well, getting money.
Yeah.
I mean, writing papers is hard, At first it's really, really hard, and then you do it again and it gets a little easier, and you do it again and it gets a little easier. And then once you've done it a bunch of times, you know how to do it and you can do it. So it's a challenge at the beginning, but eventually it gets easier. Money, on the other hand, is getting harder. So, 20 years ago it was a heck of a lot easier to get money for your research than it is now. So that is definitely by far the biggest problem.
Which also throws out, at University of Michigan, we were actually required to take a grant writing course. I don't know if that's true of a lot of the places that you went, and I think it's probably the most important thing that students who are going through, even if you don't like it, you should know how it works. Because, and even if you don't end up being the one who writes it, you still need to know what's involved. And there is kind of formulas to it. And I had a really good grant writing course, and it was actually the guy who I took the grant writing course from actually hired me for a job afterwards for 4 years. So that even panned out just from that as far as I was. But I think it's a really important skill to have, and it's getting harder and harder, and there's no great way to land it.
All right, and we can break for questions again. So if you guys have questions, go for it.
Perhaps not.
Yeah, there are no. Okay.
Uh-oh.
So getting back into those challenges and the rewards, sort of like, and getting back to Jeff's final comment, what changes would you make in the way we teach our scientists, whether it be at the undergraduate or the graduate level, so that it can enhance their rewards and diminish, at least, or mitigate the challenges?
Good questions.
Tricky one. I tend to be one who doesn't like a lot of constraints on the program, and so I had a really nice program that let me be really flexible. I'm not particularly good at languages, and so University of Michigan allowed us to take computer languages as an option, which that was a time of Fortran when computers were not even in existence. I mean, I used punch cards when I went to school. That just gives you an idea. Like, we did not have laptops; we had punch cards, but that Fortran still really did pay off for me later, because a lot of our mark recapture programs were Fortran based. So I think having that flexibility and letting the student kind of choose, but that's also a tricky thing too, because when you're a student, you don't know what to choose. so it's, you do need certain parameters, but that's why I say it's kind of nice to make sure that people are getting a grant writing course and and some things along that line. But yeah, I don't know, any ideas?
Well, I would say always have a plan B, right? So that's really crucial, is you have your kind of main project, the thing that you really want to do that's bigger, and then you need a whole bunch of other smaller things so that you can get those rewards, even if they're at a smaller scale. You still get that benefit, and then you can still be productive while you are able to manage the bigger thing that you want to pursue. Because otherwise, sometimes getting that after that big thing can be really hard. But if you have enough of the smaller things, then that can keep you going.
And are you saying like smaller projects that don't require big grant funding?
Exactly. Yeah. So things you can do on the cheap, things that don't require you to buy tickets to fly to New Zealand. Because that's going to be thousands of dollars. So so essentially, small projects that can be cheap, that you can do yourself, that you don't need other people to do, so things like that.
And you can do fabulous projects on the cheap. I mean, our molecular lab and our lab, I don't think we've spent more than $1,000 for equipment yet. And we have a complete lab. It's all hand-me-downs from Yale, hand-me-downs from USDA, hand-me-downs from other places. We kind of scrounge, get, and then you buy the parts that you're missing. But ours is a really modern 1985 to 90 lab, but it works.
There were a couple of questions.
Yeah, I saw Lynette.
I was just wondering, as scientists, if you think that this March for Science is a good idea, because I know it's sort of controversial in this political climate.
Oh, yeah. So maybe you were listening to the same NPR
The people here at National Public Radio this morning had a kind of discussion from both scientists and non-scientists, but like whether or not people should march in March for Science, or whether we should still look, not like we're trying to side against one party or the other, because it could put us in even more trouble down the road. And it's a really tough call. I'm torn myself. I don't know what to do on it. And
Well, I'm not torn at all. I think that, we're scientists, but we're also humans.
Right.
And the idea that scientists are like above all fray and somehow removed from bias is crazy. I have biases, and I acknowledge my biases. And for as long as people know that that is the case, then that's fine. They can take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm not going to claim any kind of moral superiority or just, neutrality in anything, because I'm not neutral about anything. I have very strong opinions, and I'm fine expressing those. And so I think the march is a fabulous idea. I'm planning to be there if I can be there, and I will be holding signs. You better believe it.
All right. I'll take one more, Leon.
Well, it's just kind of a silly question, but Patty, how did you get unlost?
I'll tell you that. No, I'll tell you that story in the Science After Dark. It involved a lot of tears, actually. Yeah.
I think it was John Muir that they asked him, well, have you ever been lost in all your ramblings across the country? And he said, no, I've never been lost, but I've been a bit bewildered for 3 or 4 days.
So the March question was a very good transition into this last section. The last portion of this is really going to be about science and society, and talking about science in this broader kind of context. And the first question I have here is, why does science matter? I'm going to direct that at Patty. So there's a lot of ways to interpret that question, but go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually today in Amazon ordering a book that's like, how science has transformed the modern world, right? So there is a title for you. That's why science matters, is because science is really what transforms our lives into something better. And that it applies to every single realm, right? So from medicine to technology and agriculture and architecture and everything that you can think of, science has played a vital role in it, and is probably the most important human endeavor, really, is understanding the world around us and then trying to make sense of it and then expanding that understanding. And so why does it matter? Because without it, we really would still be, living in caves. I mean, our ancestors were scientists. They were experimenting with stuff so that they could, do more and be more successful. And we have continued to do that. It's just we've become more sophisticated.
Okay, so why do you guys think parts of U.S. society or the general public sometimes mistrust scientists and the scientific process? Jeff, you can take a stab at that.
I was afraid of that. Boy, it's horrifying to see some of the things that are out there right now. I don't know if any of you have read the book Merchants of Doubt, and which is about. It's a really good read on this very subject, and it's basically there is a real push to make misinformation out there, and it's really amazing what a couple guys can do. There's really 2 primary people in the book Merchants of Doubt who start out trying to create doubt about lung cancer in cigarettes, and they actually figured out that if they could just give $1 million to almost every university across the country to do research on cancer, but not cigarettes, then anytime a case came up for cigarettes, what they would do is bring in the guy who works on asbestos and some rare cancer, and they would say, well, do you have asbestos in your house, or have you ever had asbestos in your house? Well, every house almost in America has had asbestos in it. So you create this doubt that, well, maybe your cancer is really from that, even though there may be no idea for it. So there is really and these same 2 guys actually went on to work on Star Wars project for Reagan's administration. Then when they got booted out of that, they ended up going to get into the climate change business and creating doubt on climate change. And you really have to read the book because there's almost 1 million pages of documentation online. Every line in that book is practically footnoted, so that you can go back and check the sources on every little thing, because they knew they were going to get sued by these two guys, and it's just ruthless. So it makes it a really tough environment to get out there and get the right message out when there is so much misinformation. And so I mean, and the public has a right to be slightly, to be concerned, because there are, I mean, for any subject that you work on in the sciences can be tweaked to a really evil twin of doing something really bad with it. So that's why, again, it gets back to your integrity issue. It's really important that scientists hold to that integrity, and I think that's really our key, and I don't know how else to.
Well, so I think that there are two kind of big problems. One is that people, we get exposure to the news and news about science all the time. And so imagine you guys are watching the morning show, right? Anyone who's listening to morning shows. And it's like, new study shows that, you have to eat all these vegetables every day to be healthy. And then the next week is like, actually science shows that these vegetables are not so good for you. In fact, you should be eating these fruits. And then the next week is like, no, now there is this other thing that actually meat is really good for you. And the next week is, no, it's actually meat is bad for you, don't eat meat, eat this other thing. And so there's always like this kind of, changing stories that give people the perception that, well, scientists don't know what they're talking about, right? Because they can't even agree on whether I should be eating meat or not, or if the meat should be well cooked or not, or if I should eat this vegetable or that other vegetable.
But when they get to ice cream is good for you, just turn off the TV.
Yeah, right.
Good.
And so there is always, there is another expert that comes out as having, a different viewpoint and whatnot. And so what that does is that it makes what is a normal part of the process of science, which is the fact that science is a transitional process, right? So we rarely say, this is how it is, because we actually don't know, right? So we say, it's very likely that this is what's happening. And so what that turns into in the minds of most people is, well, scientists just don't really seem to know exactly the answers. And if you don't know exactly the answer to a question, then maybe you don't know the answer to any questions. Right? Why should we trust you? Why do you think that you know what's going on? And so it makes people doubt that scientists do, in fact, have answers to many questions. It's just that we are aware that the edges of knowledge are fuzzy. And when we work on those fuzzy edges, the answers sometimes change. And that's fine, that's okay. But when enough people agree with that change, that becomes the new boundary of the edge, right? And that's how science proceeds. And so because we always hear about the fuzzy edges, then it makes people wary and they don't really trust it. So that's certainly a problem. And then of course the other problem is confirmatory bias, right? Is that people generally tend to believe things that they already believe in. And so if you give them evidence for something that they already believe in, then they'll believe you. If your evidence contradicts their previous beliefs, then they won't believe you. And science does that, and it does that a lot with many different aspects of human life. And so it makes it hard for people to fully trust science, I think.
So how can scientists work to fix this problem, and why is it important, or why is it a problem, why is it important to try to address it? You laid out the problem very nicely. Now what can we do?
Yes, what can we do? Well, I think is that, you have to teach people about that, right? You have to tell them this is the process of science. It's just, when we say a theory, is something that we have amassed incredible amounts of evidence and data to support it, right? It's not in theory, like you would throw the phrase out there. But it's a matter of educating people, right? And it's a matter of helping them with develop their critical thinking skills so that they will actually ask for evidence, that they will be able to judge the quality of the evidence for themselves, not what somebody else is presenting. And so the problem is that a lot of people get their news from the media. And so the media has this tendency to want to present both sides of the story, right? And we have probably all heard about this in some context or another. And so, for example, with climate change, that has been a huge problem because, it's like, well, climate change is real, and 99% of scientists will agree that that's true, that humans are causing climate change. And then there's 1% of scientists who don't agree. But they show one who agrees and one who disagrees, right? So it makes it seem like a bunch of scientists don't agree with this, when in fact, actually, most scientists would agree with that. And so the way that this is presented in the media sort of makes it feel like we know less than we actually know. And that's really not true. And so teaching people to be critical about how they evaluate the evidence, I think, is super important. And that starts in elementary school and high school. It's not undergraduate, right? We do that with our children. We should be doing that with our children, How do you know if something is true?
Do you have any comments to add, Jeff?
No, I think
Yeah.
that's.
So I know you've all had personal experiences that relate directly to how the public, including sometimes our own government, have viewed your research. Can you each share a bit about these experiences and any takeaways you have from them? And Allison, you can start with that one.
Yeah, so my experiences with the public are a lot in talking about what people are doing on their property and how that affects the environment. And a lot of the discoveries that we're making are showing that there are certain things that we should be doing, right, or should not be doing in other cases. But I find that when you own your own property, you feel like you have a full say over what you're doing on that property, and it's really hard to listen to scientists who have suggestions of other ways to manage. And so I'll give you a few examples. I was telling you about that wintertime lake drawdown. Well, if we find out that drawdowns are bad, does that mean the people around the lakes are going to want to not do the drawdowns? Well, if they like doing the drawdowns because they like their docks, or if they don't want the weeds around their docks, period, because they want to swim, then they don't care how many fish or bugs are in there. It doesn't matter. That's their property and they should have a say over that. And I mean, this goes to a lot of things. We do a lot of work on dam removal, and it's really tricky sometimes in some communities to convince them that the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem, is that without a dam and that lake that, yeah, you happen to swim in and your parents swam in it and it's been there for generations, but that isn't what is, the natural ecosystem out there. And so that's a change from what we kind of have grown up with, a change from what we believe, and it's really hard to accept those sorts of changes. And it's honestly, it's really hard to be told what to do on your property when you own a property. So when we find out that, like there's water shortages and we shouldn't be, irrigating our lawns, the people who want a green lawn, they want a green lawn and they're going to do it anyway. When you want to build a building over there and, oh, well, I happen to have a wetland in the backyard, and you're going to tell me that there's some, law that says I can't fill that wetland, or there's some endangered species somewhere on my property, who are you to tell me what to do? And so it's, I don't want to paint the picture that a lot of people aren't environmentally conscious. I think it's actually the opposite. We do have a lot of people who care about their environment, but there's still this personal right to your own property, and hard to think about the common good, which is a lot of what we're doing.
Jeff?
Sure. Well, the most recent case for us that we ran into problems with was during the Romney administration, because we found a new moth species that was on about, maybe 40,000 acres or so in the outskirts of Boston, that came from Europe and had actually been really well studied in Europe, really well studied in Nova Scotia and in British Columbia, where this moth had come into previously. And in Nova Scotia, they released a fly that basically controlled it and wiped it out. And so we had it in a pretty narrow range, at least we thought. And so we went to, we tried to go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they said, well, first you have to do a study to tell us whether or not, how big is the range on this insect, because it's a new invasive and we don't know how big it is. So we did a huge survey to try and figure out where the moth was. And then the USDA basically said, well, you found it in several different locations, so it's actually an established pest, so you'll have to go through this other hoop to get, well, we couldn't waste that much time to try and prove all these different things that it was or wasn't. So we went to the state government, and the House and the Senate, in the areas where the damage was going, the representatives for those areas passed a little bill out that said, we would like to give $100,000 to the University of Massachusetts for starting the establishment of this fly into the population, which we knew over time would control it. And Governor Romney just had nothing to do with it. He line item vetoed us out of the budget, and even though it was almost unanimous support, and it was actually a Republican who brought it forward in the first place, and he still didn't even listen to that. He just line item vetoed, and he wouldn't talk to our lab. He just went, to the newspapers and basically said, they want $100,000 to study a moth. That's ridiculous. What a waste of money. Well, this moth actually eats maple, so it could wipe out the maple syrup industry in Massachusetts. It could wipe out the blueberry crops in Massachusetts, the apple crops, it was a huge pest and a potentially really major thing. And they just would not listen. So luckily the House and the Senate overrode him, and they put it back in the budget. They sent us a check. We bought a bunch of equipment. I went up to Nova Scotia to learn more about the system up there. Was putting traps up all the way out there. Joe gets a phone call that says Romney's office wants the money back. And he's going to line item veto you back out of the budget. And we're like, can they even do that? They've already given us the check. So Joe had to frantically, I don't know what he did, if he second mortgaged your house or what he did, but somehow Joe managed to finagle funds to give them back the money, but we had to kind of keep the equipment, because otherwise the equipment basically loses value the minute you turn it on. So we were kind of really in a pickle, and we actually just kind of got squashed. So it meant that it wasn't until Deval Patrick came in, and then he actually reinstated it and got us some money to be the initial money to repay back what we had already basically started. But we were so far behind at that point that this moth is doubling every year. So 40,000 to then 80,000 to then 160,000 acres, and it's now on about 2 million acres. So we're still chasing the moth many years later, but starting to get it under control, and we now have the fly to where, a system that we can manage. But it's just a shame that it had to go that long, and so sometimes you just hit these brick walls. And the Boston papers were actually saying, one of the quotes was Howie Carr, who was the horrible one from Boston. He put a quote in there that UMass wants $100,000 to study a moth. That would buy a lot of mothballs. And that was like his whole thing. So sometimes you just can't do.
Yeah. And Patty, can you tell us about your experience with how people or the government view your science?
Yeah, so
you get it, right?
that's right. Yeah, so I study genitalia, right? I was saying that, and I got a grant from the government to study genitalia of ducks, and this is, it's a really cool evolutionary arms race between males and females, and we were learning a lot about the mechanisms that actually act to result in incredibly exaggerated morphology and just really bizarre behavior. And then one day I woke up, and there it was all over the internet with this stories about how the government was wasting $350,000 on a project to look at dog penises. And it was really baffling, because up until that point, my research had always been written up in really positive ways, because it's interesting. It's, sex is violence, what's not to like? But this was like the real first experience with this kind of politicizing of science, because this was all happening during the sequestration back in 2012, in case some of you remember what fun that was. And some of the stuff was trying to essentially directly link the fact that we were canceling White House tours with, the fact that I was getting money to study duck penises. So it was very clear that it was, this sort of periodic thing that happens with government, which is every time there is any kind of budget discussion or whatever, and we're trying to figure out who's going to get what little money we have in this country, then they always start holding up things that they think are examples of waste. And oftentimes those end up being scientific projects. And so, again, because we don't have a public that's as educated as actually it should be, it's a cheap shot, right? So ducks are funny, penises are funny, duck penises are even funnier. And so it makes a nice punchline, right? Like a mothball. Lots of mothballs. Yeah, it makes it sound kind of ridiculous. And so when taken out of context, science can really be mocked and made fun of. And so the important thing, I think, is that scientists really need to step up to the plate and respond to these attacks on science. Because, it's not really an attack on duck penises. There's nothing wrong with duck penises, they're cool. It's actually an attack on science. And so that's really what we need to fight.
Thanks. So how are you as scientists engaging with this current political climate, and what can we as citizens who care about science do to help people maybe who aren't scientists but who care about science? Give us some action items for scientists and for non-scientists maybe. I had Jeff and Patty down for that, but whoever wants to answer.
I have an easy one for anybody who can afford it, is give money to organizations that fight for science in Washington. So the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement, the Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, American Association for the Advancement, okay, anyway, AAAS, they are one of the main organizations in Washington that actually lobbies in Congress for science and for funding for science. You can get a membership. The benefit is you'll get Science magazine in your mailbox, which is an absolutely amazing read. So give them money. There are many others. The American Institute of Biological Sciences, you can also give them money.
Union of Concerned Scientists.
Union of Concerned Scientists, the Association of Universities. So there are several that could use your money, and they actually lobby in Washington and they fight the good fight. So that's something that if you can afford it at all, give them money. And then other things that you can do are certainly teaching stuff in classrooms. So anybody who's a teacher in high school, middle school, elementary school, teach about the process of science and the distinction between basic science and applied science and why it's important to do both. So teaching, using social media, right, to spread positive stories about science rather than cat videos, so cute as they are. Social media can really be used for some positive conversations in this country, so using social media to spread good ideas about science is also good. And then training students to become advocates for science, right, so for scientists themselves, like Lisa, she's training a lot of students, and if some of them end up going into science advocacy or even government, right now with the current climate, there are actually several scientists that are running for office. I think that's great. I think right now we have maybe one or two in the entire Congress. So clearly we need more people who actually know science and understand science to make decisions about science and the future of science.
That's well put.
Anything to add?
Yeah, likewise, just try and get your information from reasonable sources like New York Times, London Times, if you want to go outside, BBC, things like that. Because we just have to get a handle on all the crazy news, and we've got to get to the point of actually understanding. Check references, check sources. If you're posting on Facebook, please check 4 times to make sure before you post that you're not throwing up something that's just completely wrong on either side. It's not a one side or other. We just are getting really distant from truth, and that's a scary time. So
All right, thanks. Now we can turn back out to audience questions for the last bit here. Anybody?
We've really had a wild climate thing going from the snow day to the warm day here.
I know.
So I'll more of a comment or elaboration. There's also the National Center for Science Education, and they are basically fighting efforts to, the efforts that come out about people wanting to stop teaching evolution in classrooms or stop teaching climate change. And they are at the forefront of keeping science in schools, and among other things. And so they're the National Center for Science Education.
Thank you.
I was wondering your experience with the funding for the moths. Did you have any good press that was helpful in that at all? Or was that, I mean, I sometimes, I wonder
well,
about.
Romney really controlled the media at that point, and I mean, Joe put, he was, if you Google Romney winter moth, and you'll find Joe's name on about 50 different newspapers. The Utah newspapers, because Romney was a Mormon, were covering Joe, head to head with, not a lot of really good press. I mean, we definitely had some support, but not enough. I mean, Joe might know better than me as to how, I mean, it was a tough fight, because it's just.
An AP wire, I was talking to a reporter.
Oh, that's right.
I thought
That's true.
there was an AP wire story that went out, and like you said, it was published in San Jose, Houston and stuff, and Romney got pretty bad because he was basically quitting that, he was kind of an idiot.
Did you get your question?
Well, I had a little bit of a follow-on, and that's just in terms of this last question, how to help society become more aware of and positive towards science. How do we affect the media so that they cover things like that to kind of hold policymakers accountable for the government doing things for the public good, things that scientists may have evidence to show, what will be for the public good. A lot of those news stories are not out there.
I mean, I think it is going to take having a lot more scientists bite the bullet and run for office, because I mean, there's actually now a fly guy who is really running for office out in, I think, California. But yeah, I mean, I think that one of the best fights that we have is to go that route, but it's a real challenge, and it's not. I mean, we did okay over time, and we knew eventually we would get the funding. It's just when it's really a struggle when you have something cornered and it's not on a very big area, and the solution for it because another country has already done the work for you, and all we had to do was cut and paste their model and adapt it to here. So it was kind of a no-brainer to do. If Romney would have just talked to us, I think we could have talked sense to him, but we couldn't, either.
Exterminator instead of a scientist.
Right.
Yeah, right.
That's true.
I mean, maybe.
Gotta change your title.
Yeah.
Time for one more quick one, and
Well, I just want to follow on to that. We're all in favor of general public education, understanding risk, but it seems like there's a lot of opportunity for formalized and direct communication between science and the media. I mean, media is really good at the two-side controversy. That applies to politics and sports. It doesn't apply to science. We need to become better communicators and better mobilizers of the media when the fly needs to be dealt with right away, and vice versa. How do we educate? There's some good science writers, but how do those two fields better understand what's required of the other field so they can accurately provide good information?
I did end up having science writers, once we actually started the project, I could take science writers into the field with me and show them what we were doing, and then we were starting to get really good press on it, and that's kind of what you have to do, but you got to get that foot in the door to start it.
Yeah, I was going to make the same comment. It takes us as scientists to be willing to work with the media. And generally, I mean, it's kind of overgeneralization that scientists are afraid to, because why Why? Because we're always misrepresented, and we like all of our facts right. And if you quote us a little bit wrong, then we're upset about that. And so, we need to just not uncontroversial things, but just regular science information, be better about getting that out so the public is more used to that sort of thing. And we do have, at UMass we have some fantastic people who have science backgrounds and media, and they're doing great stories, little YouTube clips, all sorts of great things. And it just takes us telling our story, sharing our story, being willing to talk with them about that, and being, they told me at one point, you need to be good at responding. Media runs at a kind of different pace than science does. And so if they've got a story and they're ready to put it, you have to turn that around right away. And so if we start to be really responsive to media requests and be willing to put ourselves out there and share our stories, I think they'll be willing to get that out there.
Thank you. I'm gonna cut us off now because it's 7:30. Maybe people will stick around and we can continue the conversation a little bit, but let's thank our panelists.